Hello, everyone. Welcome to this meeting of the Psalms series. My name is Aaron Kohler. I'm a senior research fellow at the Oxford Interfaith Forum and a professor of Near Eastern Studies at Yeshiva University in New York. And it's a real honor today to introduce Professor John Day, who is an emeritus professor of Old Testament studies at Lady Margaret Hall at the University of Oxford, um, closer to where this is actually being hosted than where I am. Professor Day has been a fellow and tutor at Lady Margaret Hall since 1980 and has been emeritus now for a little bit more than a decade. He has had fellowships at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem and Durham University, and has both a PhD from Cambridge and a doctorate in divinity from Oxford. His CV is quite long. His name is on 17 books, last I checked, including 2 books of essays recently on themes in Genesis 1 through 11, which are all in preparation for what's sure to be a monumental commentary on that first pit, the first chapters of the Torah, Genesis 1 to 11, in the very prestigious International Critical Commentary series. I will not read more lines from his CV. We could spend the rest of the hour doing that. Instead, I will turn the microphone over to Professor Day with the topic, was Genesis 1 dependent on Psalm 104? Professor Day, please.
Thank you for that kind introduction. And hello, everyone. I hope you all have the handout sent online, as it might help you follow this lecture a bit better, which has a lot of detailed matter in it. It might also be helpful to have your Bibles open at Genesis 1 and Psalm 104, but don't worry if you haven't. This lecture is a spin-off from my work on the ICC commentary on Genesis 1 to 11, which I've been working on for many years and on which I labor every day. I'm now 76 and have taken a vow to finish it by the time I'm 80. This seems wise, since I have to tell you that a large number of would-be contributors to the ICC commentary series over the years have died before finishing their task, a fate which I hope to avoid. And I fear that some people never got started even. Anyway, so that's by way of introduction. Here now for the lecture proper. The creation psalm, Psalm 104, has some remarkable parallels with the priestly creation narrative in Genesis 1. Most notably, each day of creation in Genesis 1 has corresponding parallels in Psalm 104, coming in the same order. And this is not as well known as perhaps it should be. Thus, day 1, Genesis 1, day 1, creation of light, compares Psalm 104, verse 2a, where God is wrapped in light. Genesis day 2 of creation, creation of the firmament, compares Psalm 104, verse 2b. Genesis 1, day 3a, God controls the waters and dry land appears, compares Psalm 104, verses 5 to 9. Genesis day 3b, creation of vegetation, compares Psalm 104, verses 14 to 18. Genesis 1, day 4, creation of heavenly luminaries, compares Psalm 104, verses 19 to 23. Genesis day 5, creation of sea creatures, compares Psalm 104, verses 25 to 26. Genesis 1, day 6a, God creates animals and humans, compares Psalm 104, verse 30. Genesis day 6b, God gives animals and humans food, compares Psalm 104, verses 27 to 28. Sorry to bore you with this list of parallels, but I was wanting to bring home to you how strong the parallelism is. the sharp-minded among you might have noticed that the last two items that I listed from day 6 come in reverse order from each other. I'll be dealing with this later. There is a simple explanation as to why this is the case. Now, there are also numerous parallels in vocabulary between Genesis 1 and Psalm 104. Most strikingly, the phrase in Hebrew, lemoadim, for appointed times, is applied to the role of the heavenly luminaries only twice in the whole of the Hebrew Bible. Once in Psalm 104, verse 19, and the other time in Genesis 1, verse 14. And both of these are in the context of recounting the works of creation. In fact, every day of creation in Genesis 1 actually has verbal parallels occurring in Psalm 104. And I'm now going to bore you with a further list of these remarkable parallels. Thus, day 1, both Genesis 1 and Psalm 104 mention Shamayim, the heaven, Tahom, the deep, Ruach, wind, with bird-like associations in each case, which I'll be telling you about later, Haaretz or Eretz, the earth, and Or, light. That's just day 1. Day 2, both Genesis 1 and Psalm 104 mention Mayim, water, and Shamayim, heavens. Day 3, both Genesis 1 and Psalm 104 mention Makom, the place to which the waters, the primordial waters, are assigned by God. And both Genesis 1 and Psalm 104 recount the creation of Asaph plants and 8 trees. Day 4, in both Genesis 1, the heavenly luminaries, and in Psalm 104, the moon alone are created lemoadim, for appointed times, as I mentioned earlier. Day 5, both Genesis 1 and Psalm 104 mention great Gedolim, sea monsters, or great Gedolot, sea creatures. With a sea and both use the root resh mem samek, both resh mem sin, creep, to creep, in connection with the sea creatures, and both use the root marley, to be full or to fill, in connection with the creatures. Finally, day 6, both Genesis 1 and Psalm 104 use the rare poetic form ayetô, beasts. So they both use the same rare phrase. In both Genesis 1 and Psalm 104, God creates bara, humans or living creatures, and in both Genesis 1 and Psalm 104, God gives them food, Natan la'ochla in Genesis 1 and Natan ochlam in Psalm 104. I think that's near, there won't be many more boring lists of parallels, but the best is to come. Now, how are we to explain these remarkable parallels? There is no consensus amongst scholars on this subject, and you can find some eminent scholars think that Psalm 104 is dependent on Genesis 1. As one scholar put it, Psalm 104 is Genesis 1 set to music. On the other hand, other eminent scholars maintain that it is Genesis 1 that is dependent on Psalm 104. And finally, there are yet others who claim that neither the Psalm nor Genesis is dependent on the other, but they're both dependent on some other common source that we don't have. Now, although this third proposal is not impossible, it seems to me that the degree of parallelism is so great that it is likely that one is dependent on the other. The principle of Occam's razor, according to which the simplest hypothesis is to be preferred, certainly favor this. And I shall now put forward my 5 main arguments that it is Genesis 1 which is dependent on Psalm 104. So firstly, my first argument is that the depiction of creation is much more mythological in Psalm 104 than in Genesis 1. For example, both the beginning of Psalm 104 towards the beginning of Psalm 104, God has an actual battle. He has a real punch-up, a battle with the sea at the time of the creation of the world. Whereas towards the beginning of Genesis 1, God's control of the waters at the time of creation is simply a job of work. Again, in Psalm 104, we read of Leviathan in Hebrew, a mythological name for a type of sea monster ultimately appropriated from Canaanite myth. He's called Litan or Lotan in Ugaritic, as in the Baal myth. Whereas Genesis 1 verse 21 simply speaks of God's creation of great sea monsters, so much less mythological sounding. Of course, you could argue that the more mythological need not necessarily be more ancient than the less mythical. For example, the depiction of the creation in the book of Job, say in Job chapter 27 or 38, is more mythological than in Genesis 1, but it's generally regarded as later. However, I think there is a crucial difference here. The references in Job are clearly not dependent on Genesis 1, nor the other way around, but the parallels between Genesis 1 and Psalm 104 are so close as to suggest a genetic relationship. It has in any case been widely accepted that Genesis 1 reflects a demythologization of an earlier creation myth. That seems to be widely accepted. Hermann Gunkel, in his famous book Schöpfung und Chaos in Urzeit und Endzeit, Creation and Chaos at the Beginning and the End Time, which Wellhausen rather unfairly called this book More Chaos Than Creation. Anyway, in this book, Gunkel in 1895, and many scholars subsequently have claimed that the prototype for God's control of the waters is the battle with the Tiamat in Enum Elish, the so-called Babylonian creation epic. But as I will show later, this is not the case. Secondly, my second argument is that in Genesis 1 verse 24, very unusually, we find a rare form of the Hebrew word for beasts, Hebrew ayetô, which elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible is found only in poetry, including, interestingly, our Psalm 104 in verses 11 and 20. But elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, it's found only in Psalms 50, 79, Isaiah 56, and in Zephaniah 2. Moreover, Genesis 1 and Psalm 104 are the only places in the whole of the Hebrew Bible where ayetô occurs in a creation context. This rare poetic form of the word is employed here instead of the usual construct form of the word hayah, namely hayat. This strongly suggests that a poetic source underlies Genesis 1, presumably Psalm 104. Otherwise, it is difficult to envisage why this prose text would adopt such a rare poetic form. By the way, can you still see me? Hello?
Yes, Professor Day, we see you just
You
fine.
can see me. I see. Because you went off the screen. I wondered whether you could still hear me. Good. It's a relief. Thank you. So that was point 2. Thirdly, it makes more sense, I think, to suppose that the Genesis creation account has taken up Psalm 104 and expanded it to highlight the special role of humanity in the divine scheme of things and the sacred nature of the seventh day. I think that's more natural than to suppose that the psalmist deliberately omitted 2 of the most important theological themes at the climax of the Genesis creation account. The priestly writer could easily have known Psalm 104 from the cult. After all, if the priestly writer was a priest of some kind, he presumably had something to do with the cult, and it's generally accepted that the Psalms had their setting in the cult. So it seems very understandable that the writer of Genesis 1 could have known about the Psalm from, the sphere of worship in which he was involved. Now, there's a scholar called Philip Guillaume has actually claimed that Genesis 1:1 to 2:3 is more of a sabbatogony than a creation account. Now, before I read this, I'd never Never heard of the word sabbatogony. I don't know if you're in the same position. Sabbatogony, never heard of it. It's not in most dictionaries, but it seems to mean something like explaining the origin of the Sabbath. And now, I think it's an extreme, exaggerated statement to say that Genesis 1 is more of a sabbatogony than a creation story. When you think about it, 31 verses are devoted to the creation of the world and only 3 to the prototype of the Sabbath. But I do accept that God's consecration of the seventh day as holy is one of the 2 climactic events in the creation narrative, the other being the creation of man and woman in the image of God, and they're subsequently being given rulership over the animals and the earth. To imagine the opposite process having taken place, the psalmist would deliberately have had to omit the 2 important climactic elements from the Genesis account and then written up all the rest in superb poetic form. This does seem rather unlikely. If the psalmist was dependent on the priestly Genesis 1:1 to 2:3, it would be especially odd if he omitted the reference to the Sabbath, since the Sabbath was becoming increasingly prominent in the exilic and post-exilic periods. As I already noted, it is much more natural to suppose that the priestly author of Genesis 1 has expanded the content of Psalm 104, which you could well have known from the cult. That's 3 points. My 4th argument is as follows. In Psalm 104, verse 9, the following words are addressed by the psalmist to God, and I now quote, "You set a boundary that they," that's the waters, "may not pass, so that they might not again cover the earth." End of quotation. These words clearly refer to the primeval waters that God has just put under control in the previous verses 6 to 8, equivalent to Genesis 1, verse 9. It is quite clear from the context that it is these primeval waters at the time of creation to which God has set a boundary so that they would never cover the earth again. If this is the case, and if Psalm 104, if this is the case, and if Psalm 104 was directly dependent on Genesis 1, as some suppose, then the psalmist would surely have been aware of the story of Noah's flood a little later on in Genesis. Now, of course, in the flood story, the primeval waters do indeed again cover the earth. Now, one scholar, David Barker, has attempted to get round this problem by arguing that Psalm 104 verse 9 is actually speaking of Noah's flood. However, this is quite contrary to the context of the verse in the psalm. Moreover, Barker states that he thinks Psalm 104 verse 9 must refer to the time of the flood rather than creation, since otherwise it will be contradicting what the Bible says elsewhere about the flood later covering the earth. It is thus quite clear that Barker's conservative theological convictions are dictating his conclusions at this point. It surely makes better sense to suppose that the author of Psalm 104 did not know of the flood story, or he would not have said what he did. Fifthly, and this is my last of the 5 main arguments, but it does go on rather a lot, it has long been noticed that Psalm 104 has remarkable parallels not only with Genesis 1, but also with the 14th century pharaoh Akhenaten's famous hymn to the sun god Aton, which is engraved on the western wall at the entrance of the tomb of Pharaoh A at El Amarna. Now, I've actually been to El Amarna several times and seen Akhenaten's inscription. Lots of tourists don't go there because it's thought to be one of the more dangerous parts of the country in Middle East, in Middle Egypt. And when I've been there, there have been more security men than tourists, and I've seen no sign of a terrorist anywhere. Anyway, there you are. I'll get back to my lecture. As I've argued in detail elsewhere in a volume on the Psalms edited by Sue Gillingham, within Psalm 104 verses 20 to 30, every single verse is paralleled in Akhenaten's hymn in the form of 6 parallels. And moreover, these parallels all occur in the same order. with one exception, which I shall deal with in a moment. These remarkable parallels are as follows, and I think they're on your abstract if you look at it. Psalm 104, verse 20 to 21, compare Akhenaten lines 27 to 37. Both say that when darkness comes, the lions leave their dens. Psalm 104, verses 22 to 23, compare Akhenaten lines 38 to 45. Both say that at sunrise, people go to work. Psalm 104, verse 24, compare Akhenaten lines 76 to 82. Both declare how manifold are the deity's works. Psalm 104, verses 25 to 26, compare Akhenaten lines 53 to 58. Both say that ships go their way and the deity and a sea creature frolic, and both mention the great sea. Psalm 104, verses 27 to 28, compare Akhenaten lines 85 to 86. The deity provides food for all. And finally, Psalm 104, verses 29 to 30, compare Akhenaten lines 127 to 28. The deity is the source of life and death. I apologize again for boring you with these lists of parallels, but it's all in the attempt to bring home to you how close the parallelism is, and mostly in the same order. Now, such is the amazing degree of parallelism here between Psalm 104 and Akhenaten's hymn to the sun, that somehow or other we must conclude that the psalm was ultimately dependent on Akhenaten's hymn, which was manifestly earlier. Nobody could doubt that. We shall discuss later how this could possibly have been known to the psalmist. Such is the high degree of dependence that it is impossible to suppose that these verses of the psalm are also dependent on Genesis 1. That's my point of going into this, you see. It's difficult to think that these verses of the psalm are also dependent on Genesis 1 when you see how close the parallelism is with Akhenaten's hymn. However, there are no problems in supposing that Genesis is dependent here on the psalm. Now, Psalm 104, verse 26 declares, "There go the ships." Now, interestingly, this reference to ships is explained by their occurrence in Akhenaten's hymn. But some scholars have felt it's a bit odd to have a reference to ships in a creation psalm, because ships aren't living beings, are they? So that some scholars have amended the word for ships to get something they feel is better. Thus, for example, Gunkel amended oniot ships to amot terrors, while Weiser amended ships to taninim dragons or sea monsters, so as to provide what they thought was a better parallel to Leviathan later in this verse. However, neither emendation has textual support of any kind. All the ancient versions read ships here. Again, the Swiss scholar Christoph Uehlinger proposed that the psalm is referring to the custom of some Phoenician ships as having horse-shaped prows. I don't deny that some Phoenician ships had horse-shaped prows, but that this is what the psalm is referring to does seem a bit odd. Moreover, both emendation and presuming ships with horse-shaped prows seems quite unnecessary, since, as I've just stated, Akhenaten's hymn to the sun actually has a reference to ships at this point. And this is particularly striking in view of all the other parallels between Akhenaten's hymn and Psalm 104, which I've mentioned. Lines 53 to 58 of Akhenaten's hymn actually state, "The ships are sailing north and south as well, for every way is open to your," that's the sun's, "appearance. The fish in the river darts before your face. Your rays are in the midst of the great green sea." Now, Akhenaten's hymn alludes to the movement of ships here because this is an example of human activity when the sun comes out. This is, after all, a hymn in honor of the sun. But this solar context of Akhenaten's hymn is completely lost in the psalm, thus making the allusion to ships now seem rather surprising and out of place. It's lost its original context. But it should be noted that there are also two other parallels in this particular section between Akhenaten's hymn and Psalm 104. First, both Akhenaten and Psalm 104 refer to the Great Sea. Akhenaten, line 58, refers to the Great Green Sea, and Psalm 104, verse 25, mentions the sea great and wide. Secondly, in Psalm 104, verse 26, Yahweh plays with the sea monster Leviathan. And this is paralleled in Akhenaten, lines 56 to 57, by fish darting before the deity's face. The proposal of Spiekermann and Hosfeld and Sanger to see verses 25 to 26 of the psalm as later additions to the psalm is thus completely uncalled for, since they're in Akhenaten just as the rest of verses 20 to 30 are. So it seems rather odd to make an exception of them. Now, it will be noticed that the similar exclamation about the wondrous manifold deeds of the deity, Psalm 104, verse 24, and Akhenaten, lines 76 to 82, precedes the passage about the ships in Psalm 104, but follows after in Akhenaten. So this is the one passage out of the 6 parallels to Akhenaten's hymn in Psalm 104, 20 to 30, that comes in a different relative position to each other. Why the psalmist, or perhaps an earlier source of the psalmist, altered the original position, we cannot be sure. But without mentioning Akhenaten's parallel at all, one scholar, Adele Berlin, has actually pointed out that this passage seems out of place in its current position in the psalm, since it expresses wonder at all God's works before all God's works have been mentioned. So a somewhat later position in the psalm would have been more appropriate, which is actually what you get in Akhenaten's hymn. But you might well wonder, how on earth could the psalmist possibly have known of Akhenaten's hymn hundreds of years after it was composed, when Akhenaten's religious revolution died out soon after his death? Various suggestions have been put forward by scholars. For example, the proposal has been made by A. Baruch that Psalm 104 might have drawn directly on the Egyptian of Akhenaten's hymn, but he doesn't explain how this could have been possible. It seems incredible that some Israelite would have gone to El Amana and managed to get into the tomb and copy out all the Egyptian and then translate it afterwards all into Hebrew. It seems a bit far-fetched. There must be a better explanation than that, I think. Again, some German scholars have claimed that maybe similar sentiments to Akhenaten's hymn might have appeared in later hymns to the sun god Amun-Re, closer to the psalmist's time. But I've actually laboriously ploughed through vast numbers of hymns to Amun-Re, and I have found nothing remotely comparable to the sequence of parallels to Psalm 104 that we find in Akhenaten's hymn to the sun god Aton. The most plausible explanation, and this seems to be quite a widely held view amongst scholars, both Egyptologists and Hebrew Bible scholars, the most plausible explanation, bearing in mind that Akhenaten's period was an international one with much contact between Egypt and Canaan, as shown by the El Amana letters, is that Akhenaten's hymn became known in Canaan in Akhenaten's own time, and it was subsequently passed on to Israel by the Canaanites, and hence to the psalmist. At some point in the long process of transmission, Akhenaten's hymn got abbreviated so as to include only the parallels we now see in Psalm 104, verses 20 to 30. Interestingly, alongside the extracts indebted to Akhenaten's sun hymn in Psalm 104, verses 20 to 30, the preceding verses seem to reflect Canaanite storm god Baal mythology, as pointed out by Paul Dion. But everything has now been appropriated to Yahweh. However, the important point for our argument here is that the strong evidence for the high degree of dependence of Psalm 104, verses 20 to 30 on Akhenaten's hymn to the sun means that there is little scope for these verses of the psalm also to be dependent on Genesis 1. The obvious order of dependence is 1, Akhenaton's hymn, 2, Psalm 104, and 3, Genesis 1. Just in case you've been losing your track in my lecture, this is finally the end of my point 5. Point 5 was rather a long one. Having made what I believe to be a good cumulative case for the dependence of Genesis 1 on Psalm 104, we shall now examine how the priestly author of Genesis 1 has transformed the psalm. So this is an exercise in intertextuality, how one work has altered another, on which it's dependent. First, we should note that in spite of many similarities, the two works are quite different in genre. Psalm 104 is an individual psalm of praise. If you look at Psalm verse 1, you will see verse 1 of the psalm, you will see it's an individual psalm of praise, not a collective one, an individual psalm, extolling God for the wonders of nature. But Genesis 1 has transformed this into a highly systematized prose narrative account of creation spread over 6 days, with God resting on the 7th day. The priestly author has kept the basic order of creation in the psalm, as you can see from my abstract, and as you can see from the table, the abstract, but has made some changes. For a start, whereas at the beginning of the psalm, God is wrapped in a robe of light, the priestly author of Genesis 1 has transformed this into God creating the light, one of a series of actions of creation. But it is with regard to the 6th day of creation in Genesis that we also find some striking transformation from what we have in Psalm 104. And as you will see, I think I can explain the reason for the transformation that we have. Here we should note that the two actions recounted in Psalm 104 verses 27 to 30, namely God's creation and feeding of living creatures, are not really new actions, but summarizing what is also already in place. This is shown by the words at the beginning of verse 27. All of them look to you, that's to God, in hope to give them their food when it is due. All of them clearly refers to all the previously mentioned creatures in the psalm, animal and human, so they are already in existence. They are not newly created in Psalm 104 verses 29 to 30. And further, we already read of God feeding animals and humans in verses 14 to 15 of the psalm. Interestingly, the food in verses 14 to 15 is vegetarian: grass, plants, grain, wine, and olive oil, just as the food given to humans and animals at the end of Genesis 1 is vegetarian. This coheres with Psalm 104 verse 28, where the creatures are said to gather up the food that God gives them. This doesn't sound like meat eating. It will further be noticed that Psalm 104 verses 27 to 28 speaks of God's feeding his creatures before it mentions their creation. Now in this, it follows the order of the underlying texts in Akhenaton's hymn, to which I've referred earlier. So I think this explains the ordering in the psalm. But Genesis 1 reverses this order. It puts the creation of humans before God's feeding of them, because this is more rational if you're describing the actual creation of human beings and then giving them food on the 6th day. Moreover, P goes out of his way to emphasize the special role of humanity in the divine scheme of things. Men and women are said to be created in the image of God and given lordship over animals and the earth. This goes way beyond Psalm 104. Furthermore, P introduces the motif of God resting on the 7th day after all his labors, thus providing a prototype for the Sabbath. Finally, and this is the last section of my lecture, some of you may be glad to hear. Finally, in the last section of this lecture, I hope to give you some general conclusions about, I hope to show you some further consequences of my argument that Genesis 1 is dependent on Psalm 104. So these are further sort of small points, or perhaps not so small. Firstly, since the word to home deep is used of the chaos waters in Psalm 104, verse 6, and I've said the psalm underlies Genesis 1, there is no need to think, as some scholars do, that Genesis 1, verse 2's reference to the to home, the watery deep. There's no need to assume that this is dependent on the Babylonian sea monster Tiamat in Enuma Elish, as many have supposed since Gunkel. Moreover, it has often been overlooked that whereas the splitting of Tiamat by Marduk in Enuma Elish took place prior to the creation of the heaven and the earth, indeed the heaven and the earth are made out of Tiamat's body, in Genesis 1, the sea is split by the firmament after the making of the heaven and the earth. Compare similarly the separation of the waters after the creation of heaven and earth in Psalm 104, verses 7 to 9. Furthermore, the order of creation more generally in Genesis 1, while very similar to Psalm 104, as noted above, is not very close to Enuma Elish, contrary to what some scholars tell you. Thus, whereas the creation of light takes place early on in Genesis 1, verse 3, reflecting God's being wrapped in light early on in Psalm 104, verse 2, there is no separate creation of light prior to the creation of the luminaries in Enuma Elish. Again, the creation of the luminaries in Enuma Elish takes place immediately after the creation of heaven, but before the creation of earth, whereas in Genesis, both heaven and earth have been previously created. Moreover, in Genesis, the luminaries are made immediately after the vegetation, comparable to their sequential listing in Psalm 104, whereas Enuma Elish makes no mention at all of the creation of vegetation. There is also no mention of the creation of sea creatures and land animals in Enuma Elish, whereas these are both highlighted in Genesis on days 5 and 6. On the other hand, Enuma Elish does make reference to the creation of rivers, specifically the Tigris and Euphrates, mountains and springs, but none of these are mentioned in Genesis. All this is a bit odd, I think, if you really think Genesis 1 is dependent on the Babylonian creation epic. That's been quite a popular view since Gunkel. Now, secondly, my second consequential argument from my thesis is this: the fact that Yahweh is said to ride on the wings of the wind in Psalm 104, verse 3, prior to his conflict with the waters, suggests that God's Ruach in Genesis 1, verse 2, prior to his control of the waters, is likewise God's wind, not his spirit or breath, as some scholars suppose. Ruach, you see, the Hebrew word Ruach can mean either wind, spirit, or breath. Now, that in Psalm 104, verse 3, the Hebrew word Ruach has its meteorological sense, wind, is certain because of the mention of God making the clouds his chariot in the parallel line. But what further clinches Genesis 1's dependence on Psalm 104, verse 3 here, is the fact that both passages speak of the Ruach in bird-like terms. Thus, in Psalm 104, verse 3, Yahweh rides on the wings, notice, wings of the wind. While in Genesis 1, verse 2, the verb used in connection with the Ruach is merachefet, hovering, from the root rahaf in the Piel, which is used of a hovering eagle in Deuteronomy 32, verse 11, just as this same verb is used in Ugaritic of birds in the Akhet epic. Now, interestingly, the rendering wind for Ruach in Genesis 1 is in agreement with the earliest Jewish interpretation that we have of the Ruach in Genesis 1, verse 2, as attested by the Septuagint. And scholars agree the Septuagint of the Pentateuch was translated early on in the 3rd century BCE. And this meaning wind is also found in the Targums. Now, this is not to deny that the meaning spirit is also attested in antiquity for the Ruach in Genesis 1, verse 2, since we find it about 100 BCE in the Qumran work 4Q521, where it's stated that God's spirit will hover, ruchab, over the poor at the eschaton, another case of Ortzeit wird Endzeit, the end time corresponding to the first time, And this understanding also appears to be reflected in Jesus' baptism, when the Spirit is said to have descended upon him like a dove at the river Jordan. The rendering Spirit is also found in Philo of Alexandria and later became popular in Christianity. But the point I'm making here is that the apparent dependence of Genesis 1 verse 2 on Psalm 104 verse 3 indicates that wind, not spirit, was the original meaning. And this coheres with the fact that when there is later a resurgence of the primeval waters in the form of Noah's flood, a bit later on in Genesis, it is a wind sent by God that blows them back. Genesis 8 verse 1. Thirdly and lastly, Psalm 104 verse 8's allusion to the primeval waters going to the place, Marcom, that God assigns them, supports reading Marcom place in the parallel passage in Genesis 1 verse 9, where God similarly assigns the waters. If we follow the Hebrew Masoretic text, the Samaritan Pentateuch, 4Q Gen B, that's a Qumran fragment, as well as Jubilees and Pseudo-Philo. It supports reading Marcom with all those, instead of reading Mikveh, gathering point, that some scholars want to read in this place with 4Q Gen H, another Qumran fragment, and the Greek Septuagint. So we should render Genesis 1 verse 9 as God said, let the waters under heaven be gathered to one place, not to one gathering point as some scholars have proposed. Now, in conclusion, this is my final paragraph. In conclusion, in this lecture, I have noted the remarkable parallels between Genesis 1 and Psalm 104 in terms of both the order of creation and common vocabulary. I then presented 5 arguments in support of the dependence of Genesis 1 on Psalm 104 rather than the reverse. Overall, I think these 5 arguments make a strong cumulative case for the priority of the psalm. And at the end, I discussed how Genesis 1 has transformed Psalm 104. And finally, I briefly noted 3 further points in our understanding of Genesis 1, which I think follow from our argument. That is the end of this lecture. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Day.
Thank you.
Well, among the other accomplishments of this lecture is that you've left a good amount of time for questions and discussions. So I will ask everyone to please give some thought to the questions that you'd like to ask. If you would like to raise your hand, digitally raise your hand, that would be great. If you physically raise your hand, I may or may not notice you. Or you can put it in the chat and we'll try to monitor that. While people are formulating that question, I'll just ask one question, a reflective question. I think another one of the accomplishments of this lecture is that you trained our attention in new and insightful ways on both of the texts that you were talking about, both the Psalm text and the Genesis text, which is no small feat. I was wondering what the interfaith aspect here is. I now understand it's between Akhenaten and Israelite monotheism, so that was useful. But one
probably aren't any Aton worshippers here.
Yes, exactly. We don't know. We don't ask people questions. But my question for you is that in your initial presentation of the parallels of the elements of creation in both the Psalm and in Genesis 1, the in the Psalm, these bleed into each other in a very organic way. So the creation of day and night very smoothly shifts into the night is the time when the animals come out and then the people come and so on and so forth. Whereas in Genesis, the 4th day is separate from the 5th day in a very rigid way. Do you have any reflections on that difference as one is transitioned to the other text?
Yes, I would say that it's in the nature of the Psalms to be poetic, and in the nature of the priestly writer to be systematic and rather a bit formal and systematic, and 1, 2, 3. He likes doing things in order, doesn't he? And he's obviously got a systematic kind of mind. He doesn't go in for all this poetic sort of imaginative stuff. I suppose that's what I'd say. I mean, I agree they are quite different in genre.
Okay, very good.
Yeah.
There's a whole bunch of hands up. So let's see if
Good.
we can get through everyone. So we're just going to in order. We have I just want to make one last announcement before we thank Professor Day again. This is the last event for the Oxford Interfaith Forum for the calendar year 2024. It's actually a pleasure to go out of the year with some very good news. Dr. Gamalori has been awarded the 2024 Guru Nanak Interfaith Prize by
All right.
Hofstra University just recently. There's a press release that you can find online, and I think the forum will be sharing it with those on the email list in an end of year message. But alongside thanking Professor Day for such an excellent and stimulating lecture, we can also give our congratulations to Dr. Gamalori for all of her very hard work. And this is being increasingly acknowledged and recognized by organizations around the world in the many awards that she's been winning. So thank you very much to both Dr.
Thanks.
Gamalori
Well,
and to Dr.
congratulations to
Anderson.
Thea. Does she get some money for it as well? You don't know. Okay.
Oh, yeah, she said yes.
She has it, yes. Okay. All right. Well,
Yeah, she's going to
congratulations.
triple your honorarium. So you're
Congratulations, Thea.
very good.
Thank you.
All right, thank you all.
Thank you all. Goodbye.